Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of SPME and ESMIA, and it's my privilege and pleasure once again to welcome you all to the SPME webinar show. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to Mariam Wahba, who is a research analyst at FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She's been a prolific researcher and analyst dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood and has written a great deal on these topics, including about minorities in the Middle East. And she has a lot to say about these very issues. There's a lot to discuss regarding policy implications of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, especially post 10/7. Obviously, for all of us who are on the college campuses, we see um, a lot of the different arteries of the Brotherhood playing out on American college campuses as well. So there's much to discuss and unpack, and Mariam has a lot to talk about this. Especially, she'll discuss the massive media apparatus that the Brotherhood has as far as winning the hearts and minds of the West at large. And so that is something we'll dive into in just a minute. Um, Housekeeping wise, format, those of you who've been with us in the past know, Mariam will talk for about 15, 20 minutes at the beginning of the show. Then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your questions and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. If we do not get to your question this afternoon, please feel free to email us after the webinar and we will respond as quick as possible. So really, without further ado, Mariam, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you all today to talk about such an important topic. But first, my housekeeping items. My name is Mariam Wahba. I'm a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We are a nonpartisan organization that focuses on foreign policy and national security based in DC. And our job is to inform the American public and lawmakers and other decision makers about how to best address national security and foreign policy questions of today. And what better question to talk about than the Muslim Brotherhood? It certainly is timely, something that you're seeing pop up in headlines and from the administration, from different parts of the government, as it's coming up that the Trump administration is looking to designate the Brotherhood, possibly as an FTO, possibly as something else, and we'll dig into that a little bit more during our conversation today. I think it's important for us to start our conversation here with a little bit of background. I'm sure it's not things that you don't know, but I think it's important for us to remind ourselves so to better frame the conversation. So, the Muslim Brotherhood is a transnational Islamist organization that had its origins in Egypt, and specifically Ismailia, Egypt, by a young school teacher named Hassan al-Banna. 1928 was when he founded the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think to really understand some of his motivations and some of the ideological pillars of the Brotherhood, we have to understand what was going on in 1928 Egypt. The Ottoman Empire was a distant memory. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was a distant memory to this young man who had a particularly religious upbringing. His father was an imam in the Hanbali school of Islam, which is a very distinct niche school of Islam, jurisprudence school. So he grew up in this milieu where the Ottoman Empire had declined, and he was seeing a lot of British, what he perceived to be imperialist influence in Egypt. And I bring up specifically Ismailia, Egypt, because that is exactly where the Suez Canal headquarters was, and that's where he was during this time. So he grew up seeing this, what he perceived to be this Islamist British colonialist rule, and it really got under his skin because according to his writings, we understand that he saw Islam as a core pillar of his life. And in seeing both the Ottoman Empire and the British imperialism take shape in uh, Egyptian culture and society, he saw that the Islamic culture, as he put it, was being washed away. And this is where our story starts in telling what he saw the Muslim Brotherhood as an institution, what its goals were. And he really wanted to Islamicize society or get Islamicize again society. And this is how the Brotherhood started. So he began by going to coffee shops and other places of gathering all over Egypt and giving speeches. Some were religious, some were rather not religious. And I think that's important to note too. And our story starts here in Ismailia, but as we know, it doesn't end there. And over the next few decades, and now we're coming up almost on a century of the Muslim Brotherhood, the organization takes different shapes, takes different forms, and is imported and exported in various modes. And we see the defining feature of the Muslim Brotherhood over the next few decades is these chapters, offshoots, and branches. And each one operates with some autonomy, but I'll get to that point in just a second. I actually want to back up again and tell you about another defining moment, or really a defining person in understanding the Muslim Brotherhood, and that is Sayyid Qutb. He is a journalist and a scholar, also a teacher, which is a fact I like to hone in on because the founder, of course, Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb, these are the two ideological forefathers of this organization, were both teachers. And I think that's ironic, funny, you name the word and you could probably be applicable to it. And Said Qutb traveled actually to the United States, where he spent 2 years here trying to understand and trying to learn from the American education system. And he goes back to Egypt quite radicalized. And there's a couple of instances he notes in his writing as moving to him, and things that changed him, and things that changed the way he thought about the world, and particularly how he thought about the Muslim Brotherhood and its role in Arabic and Islamic society. And the one that sticks out to me and sticks out to a lot of people who read Milestones or really any of his writing is this instance where he in the United States attends a church meeting, and he sees that men or women are dancing together. And this moment really radicalizes him to the point that it becomes a defining moment in how he understands the role of Islam in society. And he calls it animalistic later on in his writing, how men and women were holding hands and dancing together at a church gathering. And he goes back and he really does two things for the Brotherhood over the course of a couple different years through his writing. One is he obviously injects a very violent element, and this is where we begin to see a lot of the ideological pillars of the Brotherhood really take shape and begin to influence how we're seeing other offshoots, including things like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and ISIS are two very different, distinct movements, but we do see a lot of influence from those early days of Qutb in the ideological foundations of these Islamist jihadis violent movements. So that's the one thing he does, is he injects a discernible, distinct, violent jihadi element to the Brotherhood. And the second thing he does that I think is notable is he creates a distinction between those who want to abide and those who didn't. And prior to that, that made sense, right? There are those who wanted to help Islamicize society, i.e., Muslims, who were okay with the Islamicization of society, and those who weren't, meaning non-Muslims. What Qutb does is he is very open and very willing to put Muslims in the other category, as so long as they do not abide by his version or what he perceives to be the Brotherhood's version of Islamic. And we're seeing that play out in real time even till this day, which is why you see Brotherhood media and Brotherhood narratives attack Muslim leaders. I mean, we're seeing influence operations targeting the president of Egypt, or targeting MBS in Saudi Arabia, MBZ in the UAE. And the Brotherhood is very comfortable attacking and going after other Muslim sects or other Muslim communities, populations that they feel do not abide by the framework of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is really the two key elements of why Sayyid Qutb is so important to this movement and really changed it, radicalized it for the worst. And now I want to talk a little bit about the media empire, since we referenced it, and it's been the focus of my research for the last couple of months that led up to my piece in the Free Press. And I talk a little bit about how the Muslim Brotherhood built a media empire. And this research really began as a question to myself and it was this, when people say Muslim Brotherhood media, what do they mean, or what do they get to? And I think the first immediate link that we make is Muslim Brotherhood media meets Al Jazeera. And that is certainly an important, poignant, and timely thing for us to remember, that Al Jazeera is a Qatari sponsored, Qatari funded, Qatari backed, Qatari stood up a media empire in itself, and it has a lot of Muslim Brotherhood tendencies. And I talk a little bit about that in the piece, but what I really wanted my research to get to was there's this whole other infrastructure, whole other different empire that exists even outside Al Jazeera, which is really jarring to look at as an analyst because there's this narrow understanding of the media empire that Al Jazeera built, and it certainly is Muslim Brotherhood. There's no denying that. But there's also this other empire or empires even, I don't think that's an overstatement, that exist that seek to not only support and uphold everything that Al Jazeera does, but they have their own path. They do their own thing even outside the Al Jazeera ecosystem. And that's what the free press piece is all about. And I dig into a little bit about what exactly does this empire entail? And it's really fascinating. I mean, we think about media in terms of TV channels, satellite channels, and we think about it in terms of some social media presence. But taking a look, even just scratching the surface on this Muslim Brotherhood media empire, you begin to see that the organization has infiltrated every aspect of life, and they are going after the Arab world in more aggressive, more tactical, more strategic ways than ever before. They understand where the people are, the people being the populations of the Middle East, and they're willing to meet them there. Um, I've uncovered Muslim Brotherhood podcast, and maybe actually let me take another step back here and talk about what I mean when I say the Brotherhood. Obviously, I've referenced chapters, branches, and offshoots, and this is really the primary way in which we see the Brotherhood. I'm talking about things like Hamas, of course. I'm talking about the Muslim Brotherhood branch in Egypt, which is really non-existent at the moment because the Egyptian government has done a good job of tackling it after the Arab Spring. But we're talking about chapters that start in Morocco and go as far as Iraq and even beyond. We're seeing, chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, but they're not branding themselves as the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think this is really the crux of understanding a lot of this research and understanding the Brotherhood. Anybody who has ever studied the Brotherhood will tell you that the one thing that they are excellent at, that they have done in Egypt so well, is that they've adapted to survive. Under certain duress by different Egyptian regimes, the Brotherhood will retract and become smaller as an organization, as an institution, as a bureaucracy, so that they are able to survive. And under certain contexts where they're able to, let's say, breathe, or certain regimes give them a little bit more room, then they expand and they behave a little bit differently. And that is really the agility of the Brotherhood. How they behave in Morocco is not how they behave in Egypt, is not how they behave in Jordan, is not how they behave in Gaza. And this autonomy really allows them ton of flexibility in how they're able to operate as an institution, yet their ideology doesn't change much. Their tactics might, and their strategy might, and we might perceive their ideology to have changed. For example, my colleagues often talk about the Muslim Brotherhood chapters in Morocco and how they often come off as, liberal, not really Islamist, and there's even some analysis that would go on to say that the Muslim Brotherhood chapter in Morocco had something to do with the normalization between Morocco and Israel. So it's really a tactile, agile institution and organization, but the ideology behind it remains the same. It just chooses to express it differently depending on its surroundings. And that is applicable, just as applicable in its media. A lot of the channels that we've uncovered at FTD and doing some of this research, they do not brand themselves as the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, they talk about the Muslim Brotherhood as this external third party identity that they do not associate themselves with. But if you look at the messaging, if you look at what they're saying, how they're saying it, when they're saying it, it's hard to deny that it's brotherhood. And I think this is, again, another crux of this conversation is understanding what we mean when we say the Muslim Brotherhood, because there is no such thing as the Muslim Brotherhood. There is no headquarters that has their logo somewhere in the Middle East or even in Europe, and there is no official party tagline. Yet there's these core tenet of ideas that infiltrate themselves into organizations, unions, media networks, podcasts, TV shows, and they become the voice of the Brotherhood, yet they don't want you to know it. They don't want us to know it. They want it to think that it's organic and the inevitable future of the Middle East. And I think that's where my piece in the Free Press ends off on. And I think it's really the most powerful point to make for designation is that this organization is invested in its ideology. It sees itself as the inevitable inheritor of the Middle East, and it's doing everything it can to arrive at that point. I will stop here and hand it back to our wonderful hosts for how to proceed in this conversation.
Great. Great, thank you for that, and thank you for really sharing. And there's a lot to obviously expand on here and try to dissect all around here. One second, let me also add Alex here to the conversation. Um, so let me start off by this adding a taking the prerogative. I'll ask the first question as far as where we are, and then we'll dive more into it. So to your last point, I mean, you do talk about the fact that, of course, nobody says that they're a member of the Brotherhood, and obviously nobody talks about the fact that you can't find anybody going on record that they're swearing in bayat. As far as so we talk about a closed-knit society as far as the Brotherhood, which is, I guess analogous in American terms to kind of a mafia-like type environment that we can use as an imagery. We had the experience of Mohammed Morsi, as far as Egypt goes, as far as the Brotherhood taking a solidified power. We also understand that they have Western experience. So can you talk a little bit more about as it relates to what you did with the media, the politics in the media, while not fully disclosing that they are indeed who they say they are they gaining traction? Are they, in the younger population, or the attractiveness, the kind of, again, we're seeing obviously a lot of ebb and flow in Middle East politics as far as the younger generation, and we're also seeing a lot of ebb and flow within, Western, American populations and whatnot. Talk about, the attractiveness, how that the media appeal that's playing out here, and maybe why it's so appealing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you asked me to start with Morsi because I think it's a great place to start to better understand what's happening right now. If there was one thing if somebody asked me what is the one thing we learned from the Morsi era about the Brotherhood is um, that the Brotherhood does not know how to govern, right? That was pretty clear. They were in office, or Morsi was in office for a year and 3 or 4 days, if my memory serves me. And it went pretty rough for them, mainly because they've never governed before. Obviously, building an institution and chapters on college campuses in Cairo and infiltrating medical unions and architect unions is one thing, but leading a country of what was then probably, 80 million people is very different than building an institution with local chapters that meets once a week. So the Muslim Brotherhood does not know how to govern. So where do they excel? And it's being the provocateurs and being the people attacking, or the group that is attacking those who are actively governing. And you ask, is their message gaining traction? And I think the simple answer is yes. Um, Looking at the media aspect of it, if I'm just going by some of the numbers that uh, we unearthed at FTD and doing some of the media empire research, satellite TV channels have 1, 2, 3, 4 million subscribers on YouTube. Their videos regularly get hundreds of thousands of likes and views across X and Twitter and reshares. So if we're going based off of, and there's another point here to be made, is that organic? Are all those numbers and clicks real, or are they bots? I think that's a separate conversation that we can certainly have. But if we're going on face value and seeing, is this message resonating? The answer is yes. And let's look at why, right? We're now 2025. Arab Spring was 2011, 2012, 2013, at least in Egypt. We're now almost a decade after the Arab Spring, where the young populations of these countries, and maybe I can hone in on Egypt here for a sec to remain as non-vague as I can possibly be. The youth population in Egypt was promised a lot during those years. Obviously, the Tahrir Revolution or the Arab Spring in Egypt brought down the fall of Hosni Mubarak and then saw Morsi come to power. And then you had the coup that brought Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to power, and he's now in the presidential chair for more than 10 years, I think coming up on 11. Um, and none of those promises have been delivered on even a decade plus after. I mean, the Egyptian people were promised economic recovery, not only just recovery, but a thriving economy. The young people were promised jobs after they got an education. They were promised a change from the status quo that the Egyptian people had been suffering on. And one could make the case that Egypt, at least, is far off worse today than it was under before the Arab Spring. And I can make that case. I think it's not entirely true, but there is some truth to it. So you have a lot of frustration. You have a youth population that can't find a job, that can't start a life. And when you look at it, ideology aside, I think people tend to, or analysts specifically, tend to overanalyze the Middle East and think about it in terms of ideology. But why do people succumb to ideology? Why do people choose to join the Brotherhood? It's because they can't find jobs after getting a 4-year degree. It's because they can't afford to get married and start a life that they've been promised that their parents or their grandparents had been afforded. And that's when they resort to ideology. The populations, I think, of the Middle East, particularly of Egypt, tend to be over-analyzed as over-ideological. And I think they lean over-ideological under certain pretenses. And that pretense is a collapsing cultural and political climate. So are they succeeding? Yes. But it's not just because of the message is so seductive. It's because all of the surrounding conditions and factors around them lead them to become more ideological. It's very easy to want to become an Islamist when there are no other good options.
Great, thank you. I have a lot more questions, and we also have questions from the audience, but I'm also going to let Alex ask a question here as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for this presentation. There are all sorts of questions that I have. A lot of it goes back to, in a strange way, it goes back to a one man's experience at a dance in Greeley, Colorado in 1948, I think. But we don't want to belabor that. I think my question to you is the ability of Muslim states and Arab states to respond to the new challenge. In the past, it's in the pre-satellite dish era, and then the social media era that came after that, it was easy, so to speak, to throw a lot of Brotherhood members in jail, which is where a lot of the leadership ended up, the founders, some of the founders ended up. What about in the current era? Any kind of controls? Is that possible? How are they doing?
Yeah, I think there are some states that are doing a better job than others. The Gulfies are particularly adept at handling the Muslim Brotherhood, meaning um, obviously they shut it down and they throw leaders in prison and they ensure that it doesn't penetrate um, their media ecosystems. Egypt has also done a particularly good job, although I think they're on the defense quite often, particularly after October 7th, because the Muslim Brotherhood identified um, this, how do I put this? There was going to be nuance in the way that Egypt responded to October 7th. And nuance to the Brotherhood is a way to attack moderate, practical, non-ideological leaders. So we're seeing a lot of media campaigns, using a lot of AI generated content in attacking Sisi for, not defending their Palestinian brothers and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot to say about how the Brotherhood is adapting. I think and I hate to beat a dead horse here, but because the Brotherhood is so quick to change its tactics and to change its strategy to adapt to its current um, political and cultural environment without having to compromise too often or too much on its ideology, we have to stay on top of it, or rather, the Arab leaders have to stay on top of it. So, in the early 2000, or early 2010s, right after the fall of Morsi, a lot of a lot of satellite channels were shut down, both domestically in Egypt, and Egypt asked the Turkey then to ensure that the Muslim Brotherhood fleeing Egypt into Turkey would not be allowed to operate as freely as they wanted to. And that's a great way to stay on top of the Muslim Brotherhood tactics. I think where the Arab leaders are lacking right now, and I'll speak just for Egypt here for just a moment, is they're not on top of the way that the social media is being used by the Brotherhood to infiltrate and radicalize large portions of the population. When it comes to how the Brotherhood is looking at um, its expanding media empire, and I think this is a point I made in the Free Press piece as well, they have no problem, disappearing and then starting somewhere else because there's an ideology there. There's obviously funds there. So I'll give you an example that I mentioned in the Free Press piece. This a channel called Mükemmelin. It was founded in Turkey after the fall of Morsi, and then in trying to remedy the relationship between Egypt and Turkey, Turkey actually shut them down, which was at the request of the Egyptians, which is a good thing. A month later, they appeared broadcasting out of London. This is where we see the Arab states struggle to get a handle on um, how to rein in some of this expansion of the media empire. And look, Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and whoever else wants to go to authorities in London and say, "Hey, this is a Muslim Brotherhood media channel, shut it down." Then we get into some murky territories because there's obviously a higher ceiling for um, let's say sanctions or being able to shut down a media channel operating out of London.
Great. Alex, a follow-up?
No, let's take some questions from the audience, and then we'll
Okay,
circle.
we'll come back.
Thanks.
All right. Okay. Let me try to combine some of these things that are playing out here without, and then we see if you can tackle them. There are a bunch of questions that have been asked here about, given of course the fact that the amorphous nature of the Brotherhood, and without obvious, numbers of membership, can it be banned? And how do we do the banning, given the amorphous nature of how it works? And to that end, our colleague and friend Mark Cohen is asking, also, so what evidence do we actually have to Brotherhood connections to U.S. groups in the United States as well?
Okay, I probably can't answer the latter question. We really focus, or my portfolio focuses on the Muslim Brotherhood's presence in the Middle East, a little bit of Europe, but primarily in the Middle East. So I think you'll have to save that question for Dr. Jonathan Shanzer, my colleague and boss, who can answer that question better than I can. When it comes to the amorphous nature of the organization, our approach at FTD, and look, this designation conversation is not. This is not the first time this conversation is happening. The first Trump administration tried to sanction or explore the idea of designating the Muslim Brotherhood, and it fell flat on its face because of this exact issue. How can you sanction an organization that has no headquarters, no leader? There's no like bank accounts somewhere in the world that says, this is the bank account for the Muslim Brotherhood. We at FTD have devised this plan where instead of going after this amorphous organization that really you can't pinpoint, like if you were to give me a piece of paper and told me like what is the Muslim Brotherhood, there really is no clear distinction or there's no clear answer beyond the ideological. Our approach at FTD has been branch focused. So let's look at what are the preconditions or what are the prerequisite factors that go into a designation, whether it's an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, an SDTG, or any of the other categories of designations that the United States government does. And let's look at which branches are operating and which criteria do they meet. Hamas is a perfect example. Hamas is a terrorist organization that the United States designated. So is HEMS, which sounds close to Hamas, but it's a different organization. It is the militant arm of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood that began in 2016. the State Department designated them as well. So this branch-based approach really allows us to get to the heart of the issue and ensure that all the branches, offshoots, and chapters that meet the criteria for designation as any of the things that the United States government designates, they can be targeted and sanctioned and so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you for that. Got another question, again, apropos, your work in Europe by Joanna, who's asking about the influence of Al Jazeera on Le Monde, the New York Times, the BBC, and other mainstream media. If you can, talk a little bit about that. And by the way, also any other kind of media offshoots as part of the that have influenced mainstream media, and maybe talk a little bit how that, also plays out and trickles down into the mainstream as far as winning these hearts and minds through legacy media and whatnot.
Absolutely. I can speak a little bit about Al Jazeera, although I do have to flag that we have an amazing Al Jazeera expert on our team, my colleague Natalie. So you'll have to have her on and she can tell you a little bit more about it than I can. Al Jazeera is particularly fascinating because there was a moment in time where it was the most consumed outlet in the Middle East. It was thought of as this brand new Western. I don't know if it was thought of as Western, but it was this fresh facelift to how the Middle East does media. And of course, we know it to be far from that in the moment. There's a couple of ways that Al Jazeera is problematic and a couple of ways in which American media outlets are sort of blind to it. Two perfect examples are, did you know that Al Jazeera and Bloomberg have a shared contract where they're able to share certain reporting and Bloomberg can extract from Al Jazeera reporting? Did you know that Google and Al Jazeera had a contract at one point, which I think is actually still in effect, that allows um, them to do things like the Google search engine promoting Al Jazeera reporting as opposed to something else. CNN, New York Times, I'm not sure if they've done it recently, but there was a point in time where a lot of tier one media outlets would extract and use reporting done by Al Jazeera. And that's a problem because Al Jazeera has a editorial line. They are not purely journalists in the way that you and I understand a journalist job. A perfect example of that would be um, the fact that they don't use the word terrorist in their reporting when reporting on Hamas, especially in October 7th. There's no such thing as a terrorist in or terrorism in Al Jazeera reporting. And of course, it's backed and funded by the Qataris, which are Muslim Brotherhood, if not aligned, and definitely supporters and backers of the Muslim Brotherhood. Al Jazeera is also closely connected to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. In the early days of the coup in Egypt post Morsi, a lot of Muslim Brotherhood leaders fled to Doha, where we have evidence, receipts, where Al Jazeera actually paid for the hotel suites that the fleeing Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt stayed in for weeks and weeks and weeks. So there's all these connections, and then there is an obliviousness of the way that the Western media interacts with Al Jazeera that is really problematic. I'm gonna butcher the numbers here, but I just want to make a point. One of my colleagues recently pointed out to me, so reporters, in order to get access to the Hill, to be able to access our lawmakers on a daily, have to go through some sort of vetting process or have to submit an application to be able to access all the buildings on Capitol Hill. The New York Times has something like, 126 reporters that are allowed on the Hill that, over the years they've submitted applications and are access. Take a guess as to how many Al Jazeera, a foreign funded backed media outlet, has. Maybe 10 less than the New York Times, and the New York Times is it, you know, crazy large organization that is American and has its headquarters here, and yet we're having a foreign funded media outlet have just as much access as the New York Times to our lawmakers on the Hill every single day. So the point I'm trying to make here is there's this Al Jazeera plays an outsized role in advancing the Muslim Brotherhood agenda, talking points, ideology, and it's not just happening on the airwaves, it's happening in the halls where power is wielded in Washington, D.C.
Great. Alex, I'm going to send it back to you for a sec.
Sure. Social media and other new media kind of driven narratives and campaigns have been very difficult to combat because they're so numerous. The sources are so numerous. They're so um, flexible and quick and mobile. Um, and we see that obviously in the States now, where everyone is twisting themselves into a pretzel about a couple of podcasters and their influence. So I'm wondering about the state or the condition of pushback within the Arab and Muslim world against Brotherhood narratives and not simply the platforms, but the narratives themselves. Do states and other institutions use new media, social media effectively, or do they use their old-fashioned, newspapers and TV stations as their go-to sources, outlets?
Okay. That is an interesting question. It's hard for me to talk about the way that some Arab states wield um, media and social media tools because they're not operating in an environment that we are, right? You know, like state-controlled television in Egypt is a very real thing. Nothing goes on the air unless it's been state approved in one way or another. Um, are they using it effectively to combat Muslim Brotherhood narratives? I think, it would be hard for a Obviously, the short answer is yes. Could it be done better? Yes, of course, also. When you have your talking heads on Egyptian state TV, they talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, rightfully so, or maybe not, as this boogeyman that the Egyptian people experienced, and it can't come back, and it's dangerous, and those are all correct talking points, so to speak. But I think where they fail to address the Brotherhood's rather seductive message is that they're talking about they're not addressing particularly the young population's real concerns about where they belong in society. They're being told that the Muslim Brotherhood is bad, boogeyman. Morsi's year in office brought a lot of instability to the region and to Egypt, yada, and they yada yada their way through that part. Where the Muslim Brotherhood is most effective is it offers an alternative, and it says, here is the status quo. It's not working for you, and it speaks on a very personal level. Here's the alternative. You can live in a more Muslim society that does X, Y, Z for you. And the Egyptian media milieu, as is the Egyptian general milieu, is that there is no alternative. It's just this is really bad if the Muslim Brotherhood comes back, yet doesn't address the real concerns of particularly young Egyptians today. Did I answer your job? Did I answer your
Um,
question?
Sort of. I mean, I think what I was getting at is maybe a little more simple or simplistic. Do Arab and Muslim states or other institutions, do they have multiple Instagram accounts and Twitter accounts where they're pushing out their own counter narratives or their own supportive of their own positions and also against Brotherhood narratives? How
Yes.
fluid are they
Yeah.
in using these things?
The short answer is yes. I mean, the Egyptian government particularly has, X accounts and Instagram pages for a lot of their departments, and there's like there's a general security X account that I follow, and there's an MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there's a decent amount of communication that's being done.
But do
How
they
that
have their own
communication
influencers?
That is a no, in my humble understanding of how it's done. I mean, again, this goes back to my point of what's an influencer? I mean, are we talking about like the talking head that comes on at the 10 o'clock news? Is he an influencer in our understanding of the term? Probably not, but he is state saying he's protected and guided and approved by the state when he goes on TV every night. And if we have a looser understanding of I guess my point here is we can't apply our understanding of our media landscape to the media landscape of other Arab states because it's a completely different animal.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Um,
You good, Alex?
yeah. Please, let's take some more questions.
Cool. Mariam, let me jump back for the second to obviously we focus a lot on Egypt, but go back to the Gaza scene. Have you looked also at, some of the, Hamas social media apparatus as far as the galvanizing, as far as Hamas when it comes pre 10/7 and post 10/7, and obviously we know that a lot of these charismatic individuals, Halil Haya and Abu Ubaidah in his time, and all these characters would go on and they would able to sell the message. Were there any obviously you deal you deal mostly with the Middle East, but was there any messaging there that you've identified vis-a-vis exporting the message out of the Middle East into the West? I mean, the connection between, how do you spread the narrative so they can frame what is happening in the Middle East, the way the perceived reality has interjected into American, European society, so then they are thereby buy into the Hamas narrative. When Hamas goes on TV and says, the official ministry of Hamas, etc., of health and whatnot, everybody immediately adopts that as fact. But do we see the same kind of mirror image when it comes to the social media messaging within Gaza that you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly at different points in the war, there was clear cooperation or an attempt by Hamas to influence the media narrative. And I think just a couple of months ago, the Israelis revealed that the Hamas leadership structure actually had, I think the words were not exactly this, or the name of it was not exactly this, but they had like a messaging or social media um, brigade almost. They had a set number of soldiers whose job it was to frame things in a certain way and push it out to top tier outlets from the West. And I mean, like, I hate to drag us back to Al Jazeera, but the fact that they don't use the word terrorist or terrorism when they're talking about Hamas um, is evident, is emblematic of this problem, right? You have media outlets who see their editorial line as sanitizing, helping shape, helping adopt Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood's messaging and ideology. And I think I saw it at some point in the chat, somebody asked about Al Jazeera's content in English versus Arabic. And again, I'm not the Al Jazeera expert. I'll have to defer to my colleague Natalie on this, but I think she'd be okay with me saying that there certainly was a difference or is a difference between the content in Arabic that Al Jazeera produces and the content in English that they produce. And it's not a small difference. It's not, some things are lost in translation or there's a grammatical error here. There is a distinct way in which Al Jazeera curates and publishes content in Arabic for its Arabic speakers, and there's a different way in which it chooses to present to its Western and English speaking speakers. There's this excellent essay I'm reading, or rereading by Fuad Ajmi. I believe it was in the early 2000s. I have it right on my desk. And it was for the New York Times. It's quite long, but it's very interesting, and it's talking about or the title is something like what the Muslim world is watching. And it was one of the earliest analyses of Al Jazeera and what kinds of things they're producing and how they juxtapose things like, they'd have Osama bin Laden on in one screen and the split screen, you had Shea on the other screen, and painting Islamist terrorists as these, revolutionary leaders who are coming to save the modern Arab world, the modern Muslim world. And I think these are all nuances that we might not be as attuned to, but you have millions of people watching, you have millions of young people watching who are struggling to find a path for life because culturally, socioeconomically, they're not doing so well. And then you have these outlets giving them an alternative that is not so great for American national interest and not great for really anybody involved.
Great. Thank you. One of the larger questions that we have here by David Greenberg is, can you talk about the end game? What's the larger objective of the Brotherhood? I mean, what's the world? What's the maybe you want to kind of differentiate between the particularistic statewide goals within countries in the Middle East versus the larger goals that you're seeing as far as the West. I mean, kind of, and can we look at these trends and how they're playing out, as far as political power, cultural power, and society, as far as, the big objective here.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty simple answer. It's the answer that Hassan al-Banna had. It's the answer that Sayyid Qutb had, and any of the other leaders, and it's to Islamicize society, starting with the villages, the towns, the cities, their countries, and eventually the West. When you look at, I'm certainly no expert on this, but I can speak about it very briefly. When you look at the way uh, the Brotherhood infiltrates Western cities, um, particularly in Europe, they start local by getting Brotherhood leaders, whether explicit or implicit, openly or overtly, um, getting local leaders elected to offices, then mayors, then city councilmen, and they work their way up the chain because this has been their effective, tried and true method in the Middle East. So why won't it work in the West? And the end goal is an Islamicized world. It's a world where Islam, their version of Islam, is used to rule and govern.
Great. Thank you. Alex, back to you.
Do and this is more of a doctrinal question, but there is a media aspect to it. Does the Brotherhood and its various platforms, do they face pressure from their right wing, from even more strident, um, puritanical types?
That's a great question. So yes, but I think to better answer this question would take for us to sit down and look at each chapter individually and how they operate. And because each chapter has so much autonomy, um, they can call the shots on how. Yeah, I've never thought about the Brotherhood in the terms that you're describing, Alex, but it's a fascinating analogy. They can decide how right or left they want to be politically. I think what ends up happening is because the Brotherhood has really embedded pragmatism into their DNA, and I think that's the maybe one of the few commonalities that you see across chapters and branches and offshoots is they're quite pragmatic. In Jordan, just until April, they were part of parliament until there was a plot, a terrorism plot that was unfoiled by the Jordanian intelligence services, and Jordan then decided to actually ban the Brotherhood. So there's quite a practicality that comes to the Brotherhood, and they're willing to make concessions on certain things depending on the time and what their surrounding does. I hate to assign reading. I hate when people do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's a great book by my good friend and mentor, Eric Traeger. It's called Arab Fall, How the Muslim Brotherhood Won and Lost Egypt in 890 Days. And he details some of the inner workings of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood at the time and how certain leaders wanted to be more extremist than others, and some were trying to take advantage of the opportunity they had in Tahrir Square and modernize and meet some of the other factions and encampments that were taking part of that revolution. So I know that's a little bit of a non-answer, but I hope that's a good thread to pull on for our next conversation.
Right. Well, it's an interesting one because we see as formal Brotherhood members or chapters enter kind of the political mainstream in the West. We see this in Britain now with the creation of your party and with various Gaza delegates or who form a kind of informal Gaza party, putative single issue candidates. They make and then they break kind of alliances with the broader factions within the left. We saw a lot of support in the US from the Muslim community generally, but also from organized portions which are dominated by or organized by the Brotherhood for the Trump administration because they had broken with the Democrats over gender issues and also vice versa, breaking with the breaking with the Republicans over similar kinds of issues. So these intra group politics do play a role and certainly compromise the effectiveness, the governing effectiveness of anyone who comes to power. But it's just interesting how media campaigns. I mean, we can sort of conceptualize media campaigns as being, moving in one direction when they're always being influenced from within and from the left, the right, and so on. Um,
Absolutely.
and we see this in American media, the whole ongoing crack up of the American right, whatever that is, on the basis of a couple of podcasters of all people. Um, so, but I'll stop there with my
All good.
fulminations.
We have two other, I try to combine two questions here, Mario. As far as again, this constellations. In your work, have you seen any specific role of mosques, specific mosques, in the U.S. and Europe that are, I guess, feeders into the Brotherhood? Can we identify, a specific mosque as far as how this is being cascaded that are worth looking at? Obviously, it's a challenging aspect given the fact that nobody takes ownership of being a member, but as far as hot spots or hot zones, Europe, and in the States, or from the Middle East that we can, that are worth looking at.
Yeah, this isn't something I've particularly looked at or focused any of my research on, but I do find what some of memory does. If you're familiar with memory, they, pull clips from sermons and gatherings, quite interesting and how the Brotherhood and other Islamist ideological organizations use mosques and imams as part of their messaging strategy. Memory does some excellent work there, and I highly recommend going to the website, but also their social media is great about posting some of those clips and doing a breakdown of, this happened on this date by this imam in this mosque, and seeing where there's great organizations that, in addition to memory, do that work and then track the money. Where is that money funding this imam, this mosque coming from?
Great, thank you. To Alex's last question, again, we've seen a lot of that here in the States also, this kind of extrapolation of the red, green, and left, and brown alliance that's playing out here. Is that something you're also, seeing or looking at, for example, Brotherhood connections to groups like Antifa or others, are you seeing any of that, within the social media realm? Or, obviously, the horseshoe narrative as far as the far left and the far right coming together, is that becoming more visible as far as Brotherhood influence, as far as seductiveness that you spoke about before?
Unfortunately, that's also outside of my portfolio. When I do Muslim Brotherhood research, it's primarily focused on the Middle East and understanding the roots and how those roots have grown into branches and offshoots and chapters. So unfortunately, I have not dedicated any time to that. Also, FED is focused on our national security, and unfortunately, that falls right out of that purview.
No worries, all good. Alex, I'm going to let you have the last question, given where we are at the time wise, and then we will do and we will do our best to wrap it up.
What's a good last question? Um, I mean, I remember the era when you would go into an Arab country, they would search your luggage for cassette tapes that might have the, sermon by some guy that the regime didn't didn't like. But the dam has certainly broken. On the but there's so much material and there's so many messages and narratives and there's so much social dysfunction within most of these states. Uh, there may not be a way to put the genie back into the bottle in terms of narratives. Is but is there a possibility that the audiences are going to be overwhelmed by by messages that cancel each other out, by too many voices? Um, does the strategy have a self-limiting factor, or am I sort of betraying my age here in a sense, and just with a certain astonishment looking at why do people listen to these sources when they're so outrageous and cacophonous? Um,
Well, so what I found incredible about spending hundreds of hours listening to a bunch of maybe dozen or so social media and other media, Muslim Brotherhood affiliated or backers of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology is that they do a pretty darn good job of making you feel like they are not Muslim Brotherhood. And then they go on to say all the things that a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated channel would say. Um, and you would only put two and two together as a viewer, as a consumer, if you sat down and watched hundreds of hours over the course of a couple of weeks, and at some point your cognitive function would be like, oh, well, he's saying he's not Muslim Brotherhood, but all he does is praise Muhammad Morsi and talk about why all these Brotherhood agenda items are actually not that bad, and you'd start to connect the dots. But if you're sitting there and all you're watching is Al Jazeera, if all you're watching is Mikallamin, or you're consuming a small part of this podcast, you really would have no way to tell that this is a Brotherhood affiliated outlet or this is a Brotherhood affiliated space, endorsed space. So I think it really comes down to tackling the issue at its core and identifying the certain outlets and the certain chapters and offshoots and branches that meet designation. Are any of them providing material support to another designated organization or institution? Are any of them engaging in violent extremism? The list is there for us to opine on, and going after them, making sure that they're not able to access things like banks and their accounts, making sure that they're de-platformed off certain media platforms as long as they continue to spread these hateful ideology. And it's starting there as opposed to trying to educate every single consumer and every single messaging to look for when trying to identify Muslim Brotherhood um, outlet.
Great.
okay.
Mariam, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for unpacking this. It's an unwieldy process, and obviously, we're glad that you are tracking all this. There's a lot to track and to look at. Hopefully, you can come back to the show and talk about more findings and everything else that you're looking at. Obviously, it's infiltrating everything and every being as far as our ecosystem. So it's important to understand all of that from here to the region and back and forth, and the way the whole ecosystem works. So again, thank you again for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Alex, for joining me as always. Above all, thank you all who joined us this afternoon for taking the time to listen to these critical issues of the day. Be on the lookout for future webinars. We'll have one next week, actually continuing the debate about Palestinian networks internally with Harel Chorev of the Dayan Center. He'll be on next week. And we will unpack those dynamics as well. So really, I wish everybody a good day, and we will talk soon.
Thank you
Thanks very
guys.
much. We'll be
Talk
seeing
soon.
you.